The street was a thirsty animal that day. Dust rose in angry little cyclones under the wagon wheels. The sun beat down, turning the storefront glass into a sheet of fire. It was the kind of quiet that gets loud, where every scrape of a boot heel on the boardwalk felt like a gunshot. Into that silence walked two children. They were thin as winter branches, their bare feet caked in grey dirt. The girl, maybe 6, held the hand of her little brother. He stumbled behind her, his eyes half closed, too weak to even cry. You could see his ribs through his shirt, like a tiny cage with no bird inside. She whispered to him, her own lips cracked and dry. "Just a little more, Jesse. Hold on." The townsfolk saw them. Of course, they saw them, but they looked away fast, like closing shutters against a coming storm. A woman carrying a basket of flowers pulled her skirt tight against her legs, muttering about strays in the alley. Two men on the saloon porch let out a dry chuckle. One of them spat. "Won't last the winter," he said. The girl heard him. She heard everything, but she just lifted her chin a little higher and kept walking. She had one thought burning in her head, one reason her legs hadn't given out yet. She would find food for her brother, or she wouldn't see another sunrise. Then she saw him. At the far end of the street, a rancher sat at a table outside the eatery. He was young, but his face was worn, like he'd lived too many years in too short a time. His 5-year-old daughter sat with him. They were sharing a meal, just some rough bread and a watery stew. But to the girl, it was a feast. It wasn't just the food that made her stop. It was the way the man's hand rested on his daughter's shoulder. Protective. A silent promise against the world. The girl's heart hammered against her ribs. She could smell the bread from across the street. She could feel her brother's empty stomach ache inside her own body. She knelt down, her voice a ghost of a whisper. "Jesse, we're here." His head just lolled to the side. There was no time left for pride. She pulled him forward, step by agonizing step, until they stood right in front of that table. The rancher, Thaddeus, looked up. His fork paused halfway to his mouth. His little girl, Ruth, just blinked, a piece of bread held in her small hand. The starving girl swallowed dust. Her voice came out broken, like a dry twig snapping. "Mister," she said, "my brother, he ain't eaten in 3 days. Please, just, just half your bread." Thaddeus stared. His jaw worked, a muscle flexing under the skin. He was a man caught between what was right and what was possible. His own daughter had been eating thin for weeks. Winter was coming, and every extra mouth was a death sentence. He lowered his fork. His eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with something far more dangerous. Calculation. But then his daughter, Ruth, tugged on his sleeve. "Papa," she whispered, her voice so small. "We have enough, don't we?" A long, weary breath left Thaddeus's lungs. The ghost of his wife was in that breath. Her grave was still fresh on the hill outside of town. All he had left in this world was the little girl beside him. And now, here were two more, shadows asking for the one thing he couldn't even promise his own. The silence stretched on. The girl's eyes began to shine with unshed tears. Her brother sagged against her, a dead weight. Thaddeus could just turn them away, tell them to move on. The whole town would have called him a sensible man. But her words, "just half your bread." She hadn't asked for pity, she hadn't asked for a home, she'd just asked for a chance for her brother to see tomorrow. He reached for the loaf of bread. His hands, rough and calloused from work, tore it in two. The crust cracked, a sound like thunder in the quiet street. He slid the larger piece across the table. The boy, Jesse, seemed to wake up at the smell. His little hands shot out, shaking, grabbing the bread. His sister guided it to his mouth, her own face a mask of desperation and relief. Tears finally spilled over, running down her dusty cheeks. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. "Thank you." Thaddeus just gave a sharp nod, his throat too tight to speak. Then his own daughter, Ruth, did something that cracked his heart right open. She took her own small piece of bread, broke it in half, and pushed it toward the girl. "For you," she said, her voice shy. The girl, Mary Beth, hesitated for a second. Then she took it, her hands trembling. She ate it slow, like she was trying to memorize the taste. Her brother ate like a little animal, crumbs flying everywhere, but nobody said a word. From the saloon porch, a voice cut through the air. A man that feeds beggars will starve his own come spring, Thaddeus. He heard it, but he didn't look up. He just watched the two strange children. Thin, fragile, but alive. Something was stirring in his chest. A feeling he hadn't felt since his wife died. It wasn't happiness, it was something else. It was recognition. Ruth reached her small hand across the table and placed it on top of Mary Beth's. The older girl flinched, then squeezed back. A silent promise made between two children. Thaddeus's jaw clenched again, but this time it wasn't indecision. He knew, right then and there, that this wasn't just about a piece of bread. This was a choice, a burden, and he had just picked it up. The sun bled across the horizon, and he knew the town would remember this. And they would not be kind. The bread was gone, but the two children just sat there, stiff, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for someone to take the memory of the food away. Thaddeus leaned back, the wood of his chair groaning. He could feel the eyes of the whole town on his back. He could hear the whispers starting up, like wind through dry leaves. Foolish, soft. He ignored them. He looked at the two orphans. "Sit," he said, his voice rough. Mary Beth blinked. "We don't mean to be a trouble, sir." "You already are," he said, but there was no heat in it. Just the plain, hard truth. He nodded to the empty bench beside his daughter. Might as well be trouble sitting down. Jesse scrambled onto the bench, his short legs dangling. Mary Beth followed, her hands clenched in her lap. She looked like she was trying to hold herself together. Thaddeus pushed his own bowl of stew toward them. It wasn't much, but it was more than they had. "Eat slow," he told them. Disbelief warred with hunger on Mary Beth's face. She picked up the spoon, her hand shaking, and gave the first bite to her brother. Jesse slurped it down, loud and messy, and for the first time a flicker of something like a smile touched Thaddeus's lips. Just then, the preacher walked by. He was a tall, thin man who always looked like he was smelling something bad. He saw the scene at the table, and a cold, knowing smile touched his lips. He raised his voice just enough for the whole street to hear. "Man shall not live by bread alone," he boomed, patting the Bible under his arm. A few men at the saloon snickered. Thaddeus just lowered his head a little. He wasn't a man for scripture. He was a man for dirt and fences and the hard reality of the seasons. The children just kept eating. Ruth looked up at him, her eyes wide with a question. "Papa, can they stay?" The words were unspoken, but they were as loud as a church bell in the quiet of his heart. It was a question that cut deeper than any judgment from the town. He needed to buy time. "Names," he grunted. The girl swallowed her mouthful of stew. "I'm Mary Beth, sir. This is my brother, Jesse." "Jesse," the boy repeated, his voice stronger now, with a little food in his belly. "I'm Thaddeus," the rancher said. "This is my girl, Ruth." Mary Beth whispered the names like a prayer. Thaddeus watched her, and in the hollows of her face, he saw a grief that was too old for a child. A question formed on his lips before he could stop it. "Where's your kin?" Her eyes dropped to the wooden tabletop. "River took paw, fever took ma, ain't nobody left." The words just hung there in the air, heavy, final. Ruth, with the simple wisdom of a child, reached over and placed her worn cornhusk doll in Jesse's lap. "So he won't be lonely," she explained. Jesse hugged the doll tight. Mary Beth stared at the small act of kindness, and her defenses finally crumbled. Her shoulders started to shake with silent sobs. Thaddeus felt a familiar ache in his own chest. His wife, her face pale on the pillow, her hand growing cold in his. He'd built a wall of grief around his heart, thick and high, to keep the world out. But right now, with these two broken children at his table, he felt that wall begin to crack. The stew was gone. Jesse let out a deep, contented sigh, and his eyes started to droop. From the saloon, another voice called out, "Taking in strays again, Thad. You'll ruin yourself for nothing." Thaddeus ignored him. He stood up and pulled a few coins from his pocket, dropping them on the table to pay for the meal. Mary Beth flinched, thinking this was it, the end of their brief moment of safety. But Thaddeus just looked at her and her brother. "Come," he said. Hope and fear warred in her eyes. Ruth didn't wait. She grabbed Mary Beth's hand and gave it a gentle tug. The four of them walked away from the main street, leaving the whispers and the staring eyes behind them. They walked to the edge of town, where the houses got smaller and the fences started to lean. His homestead was there, a small, rough-hewn cabin, but it stood straight and true, with a thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney. Mary Beth's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't dared to hope for anything beyond that one meal. She certainly hadn't expected this. Thaddeus stopped at the door, his hand resting on the frame. He looked like he wanted to say something, to warn them, to explain. But the words wouldn't come. So he just pushed the door open, letting the warm, golden lamplight spill out onto the porch. It smelled like wood smoke and leather, the smell of work, the smell of a home. Jessie, still clutching the doll, walked inside first. Mary Beth hesitated on the threshold, a tiny silhouette of doubt against the growing dark. Thaddeus met her gaze. His voice was gravel, but it was lined with something she hadn't heard in a long, long time. It was lined with promise. "You'll sleep warm tonight," he said. She stepped inside, and the door shut behind her with a soft, final thud. It was a sound that changed everything, the sound of a line being crossed. Outside, the town kept whispering, and they weren't just whispers of disapproval anymore. They were turning into something darker. The seeds of judgment were taking root. That first night, the cabin groaned around them. The wind outside sounded like a hungry animal scratching at the walls, trying to get in. Mary Beth couldn't sleep. She lay on a straw pallet near the hearth, Jessie's small body curled up beside her. Across the room, Ruth was asleep, a little lump under a heavy quilt. But Thaddeus was awake too. He sat in his chair by the cold fireplace, his hat in his hands, just staring into the embers. He'd told himself it was just for one night. A hot meal, a safe place to sleep. That's all. In the morning, he'd take them to the preacher. Let the church figure it out. But when the first grey light of dawn crept through the window, he was still there, watching them. And a heavy, unfamiliar feeling had settled in his chest. It felt a lot like responsibility, but it was tangled up with something else, something that felt dangerously like hope. By noon, the whole town knew. Thaddeus Morgan, the widower, the man who kept to himself, had taken in the two orphan strays. He felt it in the way the blacksmith stopped hammering when he walked past. He heard it in the sudden silence at the mercantile when he went in for flour. Two women, pretending to look at bolts of cloth, spoke just loud enough for him to hear. A man can't even look after his own, let alone two more. He'll lose his ranch before the first snow. Mary Beth was with him. He'd brought her to help carry the supplies. He saw her shoulders tense up. He saw the shame wash over her face. She looked down at her bare feet, trying to make herself invisible. Something cold and hard tightened in Thaddeus's gut. He didn't say anything. He just paid for his flour, grabbed the sack, and walked out. But he walked a little slower than usual, his back straight, daring anyone to say another word. That evening, when he got back to the cabin, he heard something he hadn't heard in over a year. Laughter. Ruth had her wooden blocks out on the floor. Jessie, his hands still a little shaky, was trying to build a tower. It kept falling over, and every time it did, all three children would burst into giggles. Mary Beth was there, on her knees, her face glowing in the firelight. For the first time, she looked like a little girl, not a tiny, weary old woman. Later, after Jessie had fallen asleep by the fire, she spoke to Thaddeus. Her voice was quiet, her eyes fixed on the flames. "You remind me of my paw," she said. "He never let us sleep cold." The words were a punch to the gut. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just the orphan, but the child who was desperately trying to find a reason to trust again. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't wanted this weight. But here it was. Ruth came and curled up at his feet, laying her head on his knee. "They can stay, Papa, can't they?" He couldn't answer. He just put his hand on her hair, his rough fingers clumsy and uncertain. The next few days were a quiet war. The sheriff rode out to his property. He didn't dismount. He just sat on his horse, his face grim. "Thad," he said, "I'm telling you as a friend. You can't do this. 4 mouths to feed is a recipe for disaster. The town council is already talking. They're saying you're not fit, that you're putting your own girl at risk." "Ruth is fine," Thaddeus said, his voice low and tight. "For now," the sheriff warned, "take them to the church. It's the right thing to do, the sensible thing." He rode off, leaving his words hanging in the cold air like a threat. Thaddeus worked his land like a man possessed. He fixed fences, cleared brush, chopped wood until his hands were raw and his back screamed in protest. He was trying to work the thoughts out of his head. But they were stubborn. The children, in their own way, worked too. Mary Beth learned to cook and clean, her small hands surprisingly deft. Jesse, it turned out, had a knack for animals. He would talk to the chickens and they seemed to listen. Even Ruth, who had always been a quiet child, seemed to come alive, showing Mary Beth her secret places in the woods. One night, the first snow began to fall. Thaddeus stood outside the cabin, watching the flakes drift down, and listened. He heard them inside, their voices muffled by the log walls. He crept to the window and looked in. The three of them were huddled under a blanket by the fire. Ruth was telling a story. Jesse was fast asleep, his head in Mary Beth's lap. It was a picture of a family, a picture he had thought was lost to him forever. A wave of grief so powerful it almost knocked him off his feet, washed over him. He stumbled back from the window into the darkness and the falling snow. To care for them meant he could lose them. To love them meant his heart could be broken all over again. He had sworn he would never, ever let that happen. But when he finally went inside, the warmth of the cabin wrapped around him like a hug. Mary Beth looked up at him. Her eyes were full of a silent, desperate question. He looked at her, at Jesse, sleeping peacefully, at his own daughter, who was smiling at him. And he knew. He had already crossed the line. There was no going back. Ruth's voice was a soft whisper in the quiet room. "We're a family now, aren't we?" Thaddeus didn't answer. He couldn't. The words were stuck somewhere in his throat, tangled up with a year's worth of unshed tears. He just walked over to the woodpile and placed another heavy log on the fire. It was an answer of a kind. The snow was piling up outside. The town was waiting for him to fail. He could feel their judgment like a physical weight. But as he looked at those three small faces, he knew they were wrong. This wasn't a burden. It was a beginning. But a beginning of what, he didn't dare to guess. Because Mary Beth was still watching him, and in her eyes he saw a flicker of something he hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just hope. It was fear. A deep secret fear that had nothing to do with hunger or the cold, and he suddenly realized these children hadn't just been running from starvation. They had been running from someone. The winter clamped down hard, burying the world in a deep, unforgiving white. Every morning was a battle against the cold. Thaddeus would break the ice in the water trough, his breath pluming in the air, his hands aching from the frost. The cattle were getting thin. The hay was running low. He started rationing it, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach with every scoop. Inside, the cabin was their whole world. Mary Beth was the quiet center of it. She stretched their meager supplies with a skill that was uncanny for a 6-year-old. She could make a soup out of a handful of dried beans and a single potato that felt like a feast. She taught Ruth how to patch clothes, her small fingers guiding her sisters. But the fear Thaddeus had seen in her eyes that night never quite went away. It was there when a stranger rode past on the main road. Mary Beth would pull Jesse behind her, her body going rigid until the rider was gone. It was there at night. Sometimes Thaddeus would wake up to the sound of her crying softly in her sleep, whispering a name he couldn't quite make out. One afternoon he came in from the barn to find Jesse sitting by the fire, his face pale, his little body shivering despite the heat. Mary Beth was kneeling beside him, her face tight with worry. "He's got the fever, I think." Thaddeus felt a cold dread wash over him. It was a fever that had taken his wife. It was the great silent killer of the frontier. He felt the boy's forehead. It was burning hot. For 3 days they fought for him. Thaddeus rode into town through a blinding snowstorm to get medicine from the doctor. The doctor was a grim man who charged a price that took nearly every last coin Thaddeus had saved. "You're a fool, Morgan," the doctor said, measuring out the powder. "Taking on strays in a winter like this. If the boy dies, the town will say you killed him." Thaddeus just clenched his jaw, took the medicine, and rode back into the storm. Back at the cabin, Mary Beth never left her brother's side. She bathed his face with cool water, spooned broth into his mouth, and hummed the same broken lullaby over and over. Ruth sat with her, holding her hand, her young face a mirror of Mary Beth's worry. On the third night, the fever broke. Jesse woke up, his eyes clear, and asked for a drink of water. The relief in the small cabin was so thick you could taste it. But later that night, as Thaddeus sat by the fire, Mary Beth came to him. She was holding something in her hand. It was a small, crudely carved wooden bird. "Jesse made this," she said, "before he got sick. For you." Thaddeus took the bird. It was rough, but he could see the care that had gone into it. "He's a good boy," Thaddeus said, his voice thick. "He is," she agreed. Then she hesitated. "He gets scared easy. Ever since before." "Before what?" Thaddeus asked gently. Her eyes darted toward the door, as if she expected someone to be listening. "Before we ran away." There it was. The truth he'd been sensing all along. "Who were you running from, Mary Beth?" She shook her head, her whole body trembling. "A bad man. He owned the place we worked. After Ma and Pa were gone, it was a lumber camp, deep in the mountains. He was mean. He hurt people." She pulled up the sleeve of her worn dress, and on her thin forearm Thaddeus saw a faint, ugly scar. A brand. It was the shape of a crooked cross. "He marks everyone," she whispered, her voice full of a terror that made Thaddeus's blood run cold. "So they can't ever get away." He felt a rage so pure and hot, it nearly choked him. He gently pulled up Jesse's sleeve. The same mark was there on his brother's arm, angrier and redder. Now he understood. The nightmares, the fear of strangers. They weren't just orphans, they were escapees, fugitives. "What was his name?" Thaddeus asked, his voice a low growl. "They just called him the Warden," she said. "He said he'd find us. He said he always finds his property." A log shifted in the fireplace, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The wind howled outside, but the real storm was inside the cabin. Thaddeus now knew that the town's judgment, the coming snow, the lack of food, none of those were the real threat. The real threat was a man with a branding iron and a cold heart. A man who considered these children to be his property. And Thaddeus had a sickening feeling that this warden was not the kind of man who gave up on what he thought was his. The winter dragged on, each day a little colder, a little harder than the last. The knowledge of the warden hung over their small cabin like a storm cloud that refused to break. Thaddeus started sleeping with his rifle by his bed again, something he hadn't done since the early days of settling his land. Every creak of the floorboards, every howl of the wind made him jump. He tried to ask Mary Beth for more details, but the fear would close her down completely. She would just shake her head, her eyes wide and haunted, and clutch Jesse closer to her side. The supplies were almost gone, the flour barrel was empty, the salted meat was down to its last few strips. Thaddeus knew he had to do something desperate. There was a town, a larger one called Summit, a day's ride east. It was risky, with the snow so deep, but he had no choice. He had to get more food. He sat the children down before he left. "I'm going to be gone for 2 days," he said, looking at Mary Beth. "You're in charge. Bar the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone. You understand? Anyone." She nodded, her face pale. Ruth started to cry, clinging to his leg. He knelt and hugged her tight. "I'll be back before you know it, little bird. I promise." He rode out at dawn, the world a sea of white. The journey was brutal. The horse struggled through massive drifts, and the wind cut through his coat like a knife. He made it to Summit, traded the last of his wife's silver for supplies, and started back the next day. But a blizzard hit on his return journey, a whiteout. He couldn't see his hand in front of his face. He was forced to take shelter in a small cave, his horse shivering beside him, and wait it out. He was trapped for a full day and night, his mind churning with worry for the children. He finally made it back to his cabin 3 days late, half frozen and exhausted. As he got closer, he saw that something was wrong. There were no tracks around the cabin except his own. There was no smoke coming from the chimney. A cold, sick feeling washed over him. He spurred his tired horse forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "Mary Beth, Ruth!" he yelled, stumbling off his horse and running to the door. It was barred from the inside, just as he had told them. He hammered on it with his fist. "It's me! Open the door!" There was no answer. Panic seized him. He put his shoulder to the door, once, twice, and on the third try, the wood of the frame splintered and the door flew open. The cabin was freezing cold. The fire was dead. And it was empty. The children were gone. For a moment, Thaddeus couldn't breathe. His mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. The cabin was empty. The blankets were thrown on the floor. A half-eaten apple sat on the table. It was like they had vanished into thin air. He stumbled outside, his eyes scanning the endless expanse of snow. He circled the cabin, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was looking for tracks, any sign of where they might have gone. And then he found them. Leading away from the back of the cabin, toward the dark line of the woods, were 3 sets of small footprints. And beside them, the heavy booted tracks of a single, large man, the warden. The rage that filled Thaddeus was so immense it burned away the cold, the exhaustion, the fear. It was a pure, white-hot fury. He ran back into the cabin, grabbed his rifle, a box of cartridges, and the small wooden bird Jessie had carved for him. He shoved the bird into his pocket. It was a promise. He didn't waste time with his tired horse. He would be faster on foot in the deep woods. He strapped on his snowshoes and set off, following the tracks into the forest. The tracks told a story. The man's strides were long and confident. The children's were small, stumbling. He could see where Jessie had fallen and where Mary Beth had obviously tried to pull him along. There was no sign of Ruth's tracks after the first 100 yards. He prayed the man was carrying her, that she wasn't. He couldn't let himself think it. He pushed himself harder, moving through the silent, snow-laden trees. The sun began to set, casting long blue shadows across the snow. He didn't stop. He couldn't. He just kept moving, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. Hours later, by the light of a full moon that made the snowscape as bright as day, he saw it. A flicker of light through the trees. A campfire. He dropped to his belly, crawling forward through the snow, his rifle clutched in his hands. He got to the edge of a small clearing. And what he saw made his blood freeze. There was a man, huge and broad-shouldered, with a thick, dark beard. He was sitting by the fire, eating a piece of meat. And tied to a tree, their faces tear-streaked and terrified, were the 3 children. Jessie was shivering uncontrollably. Ruth was trying to be brave, but her small body was shaking. Mary Beth was staring at the man with a look of pure, defiant hatred. "You'll eat when I say you can eat, property," the warden growled, not even looking at them. "First, you learn your lesson. Running away has consequences." Thaddeus slowly, silently raised his rifle. He centered the sight on the back of the warden's head. His finger tightened on the trigger. He could end it. Right here, right now. 1 shot, and the children would be safe. But then the man turned his head slightly, as if he sensed something. And in the flickering firelight, Thaddeus saw his face clearly for the first time. And his world tilted on its axis. He knew that face. It was the face of the man who had been driving the wagon that had run his wife off the road a year ago. The man who had just looked back once, then whipped his horses and disappeared, leaving her to die alone in the dirt. It was him. Thaddeus's breath hitched. His entire body went rigid. The rifle in his hands suddenly felt impossibly heavy. This wasn't just about rescuing the children anymore. This wasn't just about justice for them. This was about vengeance. The world narrowed to the space between the end of his rifle and the man who had destroyed his life. He could pull the trigger. He should pull the trigger. It would be so easy. A single clean shot, an eye for an eye. But then he looked at the children. He saw their terrified faces illuminated by the fire. If he shot this man in cold blood, what would that make him in their eyes? A killer, a monster just like the warden. He had promised them a home, safety, not a legacy of violence and revenge. He lowered the rifle, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. There had to be another way, a better way. He took a deep, steadying breath, the freezing air burning his lungs. He backed away slowly, melting back into the shadows of the forest. He had a new plan. It was far more dangerous. It relied on trickery and courage, not just a bullet. But it was the only way he could live with himself. It was the only way he could truly save them, not just from the warden, but from the darkness that threatened to consume him too. He circled the camp, moving like a ghost through the trees until he was on the other side of the clearing. He found what he was looking for, a steep, snow-covered ridge that overlooked the camp. He checked his rifle one last time, took the wooden bird out of his pocket and clutched it in his hand, and then he stood up. "Warden," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the silent woods. The big man jumped to his feet, spinning around, pulling a massive pistol from his belt. The children gasped when they saw Thaddeus standing there, a dark figure against the moonlit snow. "Papa!" Ruth cried out. "Who in the hell are you?" The warden roared, his eyes wild. "I'm the man who's going to take those children home," Thaddeus said, his voice calm and steady, betraying none of the turmoil raging inside him. The warden laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "These children are my property. They have my mark. They belong to me." "They belong to no one," Thaddeus said. "Let them go. You walk away from here, and I let you live." "You and what army?" The warden sneered. Thaddeus didn't answer. Instead, he fired his rifle, not at the warden. He fired into the snow-laden branches of a huge pine tree just above the man's head. A massive cascade of heavy snow, a mini avalanche, came crashing down. The warden yelled and stumbled back, momentarily blinded, just as the campfire was smothered by the deluge of snow, plunging the clearing into near darkness. That was the chance Thaddeus needed. He half ran, half slid down the ridge, his knife already in his hand. He was on the warden before the big man could clear his eyes. He didn't go for a killing blow. He sliced the pistol from the warden's hand, sending it spinning into the darkness. The warden roared in pain and fury and swung a massive fist, catching Thaddeus on the side of the head. Stars exploded behind Thaddeus's eyes, and he fell to one knee. The warden lunged, a giant, shadowy beast, but as he lunged, Mary Beth did something incredible. She had been working at her ropes with a sharp rock, and she was free. She threw herself at the warden's legs, a tiny, furious bundle of courage. It was just enough. The warden stumbled, his balance thrown, and that gave Thaddeus the second he needed. He drove his shoulder hard into the big man's stomach, and the two of them went down in a tangle of limbs, wrestling in the snow and the dark. It was a brutal, desperate fight. The warden was bigger and stronger, but Thaddeus was fueled by a year of grief and a furnace of righteous anger. He landed a punch, then another. The warden got his massive hands around Thaddeus's throat, squeezing, the world starting to go grey at the edges. Just as Thaddeus felt his strength failing, he heard a small voice. "Hit him with the pan, Ruth." It was Mary Beth. He felt more than saw Ruth, who had also gotten free, swing a heavy cast-iron skillet with all her might. There was a sickening thud, and the pressure on his throat released. The warden slumped to the side, groaning. Thaddeus didn't hesitate. He grabbed the ropes the children had been tied with, and with Mary Beth's help, quickly bound the warden's hands and feet. He was breathing heavily, his head throbbing, but he was alive. They were all alive. He scrambled over to the children, cutting the last of their ropes and pulling them into a fierce hug. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You're safe now. I've got you." He rebuilt the fire, and as the flames grew, casting their warm light on the scene, he looked at the man lying bound in the snow. The man who had taken everything from him, the man he had every right to kill. He looked down at the wooden bird still clutched in his hand. He looked at the three children huddled close to him, their eyes full of trust and love. And he knew what he had to do. Justice, not vengeance. The journey back to town was slow and treacherous. Thaddeus tied the warden to his own horse and made him walk ahead, the rope held tight in his hand. The children rode on Thaddeus's horse, wrapped in blankets. When they finally emerged from the woods at the edge of town, the sun was just rising. The first person they saw was the sheriff, riding out on his morning patrol. The sheriff's eyes went wide when he saw the strange procession. He saw Thaddeus, bruised and battered. He saw the children, safe but exhausted. And he saw the huge bearded man, bound and defeated. "Thad, what in God's name happened?" the sheriff asked, dismounting. "This is the man who took them," Thaddeus said, his voice flat. "They call him the warden. He runs a lumber camp in the mountains. He treats children like slaves. He brands them like cattle." He pulled up Jesse's sleeve to show the sheriff the crooked cross. The sheriff's face hardened. The warden just sneered. They're my property. I've got papers. He's also the man who ran my wife off the road last year, Thaddeus said, his voice dropping low, each word a stone. He's the one who left her to die. The sheriff stared at the warden, then back at Thaddeus. He had been there that day. He had seen the wagon tracks. He had seen the grief that had hollowed his friend out. A look of dawning comprehension spread across his face. By now, other townsfolk were starting to emerge from their homes, drawn by the commotion. They gathered around, whispering, their eyes fixed on the scene. The preacher was there. The blacksmith, the women from the mercantile. "This man," Thaddeus said, his voice ringing out in the cold morning air, "preys on the weak. He hides in the shadows. He is the very darkness we all fear. But he is not stronger than the light. He is not stronger than a community that stands together." He looked around at the faces of his neighbors, the faces of the people who had judged him, whispered about him, and doubted him. "I was wrong," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I tried to face my grief alone. I built a wall around my heart. These children, they saved me. They taught me that a family isn't about blood. It's about who you stand up for. It's about who you fight for." He knelt and pulled the silver locket from his pocket, the one that had belonged to his wife. He opened it. Inside there was a tiny portrait of her on one side. The other side was empty. He looked at Mary Beth, at Jessie, at his own daughter, Ruth. "A home is not four walls," he said, his voice thick with tears. "It's the people you fill it with." A silence fell over the crowd. It wasn't a judgmental silence this time. It was a silence of understanding, of shame, of respect. The preacher stepped forward, his face no longer cold and stern, but filled with a new light. He placed a hand on Thaddeus's shoulder. "The boy is right," he said, his voice booming. "What God has bound in mercy, let no man, and no evil, cut apart." The blacksmith stepped forward, his massive hands clenched into fists. "This warden," he growled, "will see justice. I'll see to it myself." One by one, the people of the town stepped forward, forming a circle around Thaddeus and the children, and a wall against the darkness the warden represented. They had seen the truth. They had seen the courage of a broken man who had refused to stay broken. They had seen the love that had forged a new family in the heart of a brutal winter. The sheriff put the warden in irons, his face grim. "Your reign of terror is over," he said. As they led him away to the jail, Thaddeus pulled the three children into his arms. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a father. And they were no longer orphans. They were home. The sun climbed higher in the sky, its light glinting off the snow, off the silver locket, and off the tear-streaked, smiling faces of a family that had walked through the fire and come out whole. They proved that even in the harshest winter, the strongest thing in the world isn't the cold or the hunger or the judgment of others. It's the stubborn, unbreakable, and healing power of love. What did you think of Thaddeus's choice not to seek revenge? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales that touch the heart.